Welcome to Heritage, a look at outstanding men and women from all walks of life whose achievements affect the lifestyles and culture of America's minority populations.
I'm Vivian Porter. Welcome to Heritage. This week it's my pleasure to have as my guest Dr. David Driskell. He's a curator and he's a professor of art at the University of Maryland. Doctor, welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with your giving us some basic insight into this is an exhibition that's traveled around for a while. It's called Hidden Heritage, Afro-American Art.
Yes.
And it covers a period 1800 to 1950.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that exposition.
Well, it started out last September at the Bellevue Museum in Bellevue, which is a neighborhood community of Seattle, Washington. And I was called upon by this museum and the Art Museum Association of America to organize the exhibition so that people might see a continuing tradition in the visual arts amongst Afro-Americans, beginning with the early times, a little after the American Revolution, because many people don't know that blacks were involved in the making of fine arts at that time. And so we organized the exhibition not so much to keep what blacks have done separate and apart from the mainstream as to inform all people in the country about the viable contribution that black artists have made throughout the years. And this, of course, will add to the history and to the compendia of American art. So it's this is its third stop. The second stop was the Bronx, the Museum of the Arts in the Bronx, and the California Afro-American Museum is the third stop. It will tour 10 museums by 1988.
What does this exhibition reveal about the presence of and contributions of black Americans in American art, basically?
Yes, it shows that for the first 100 years, perhaps, from, let's say, 1800 until 1900, black American artists were very much concerned with showing themselves to be part and parcel of the mainstream of American art. In my own writings, I announce this as a part of cultural emancipation, not so much social emancipation, because the artists were not so concerned with themes which reflected black heritage. They were more interested in themes which showed them a part of the American scene, the landscapes of Robert S. Duncanson, of Edward Mitchell Bannister. The religious scenes of Henry O. Tanner, for example, did not show black subjects, showed Christianity in the Euro-American concept of Christianity, not an Afro-American concept. And the portraits of Joshua Johnston, and for the most part, the sculpture of Edmonia Lewis in the 19th century. All of these works, for the most part, showed that they were part and parcel of the whole of American art, not separate and apart from.
What about the acceptance, the tendency to accept that image and that
Okay,
fact?
when we look at the works, that's a question which always comes up. One looks at a portrait by Joshua Johnston, a former slave from Baltimore, painted in 1805 or 1810, and the first thing they say is, why are these subjects white? Well, they're white because this was the patronage. They weren't black people capable of sitting and then paying for a portrait. These artists were paid a fairly handsome sum in the time for their work. And there wasn't a middle-class black America at that time to support these artists. So their works, of course, were bought by white artists. The other side of it is the revelation that these artists were very much caught up in whatever the trends or whatever the vogue was of the time. And they tried to show that they were as well informed, and they did, because they traveled to Europe, to the centers of art, just like the other artists of European ancestry did.
So basically the work then was accepted by a mainstream audience.
It was accepted by a mainstream audience in many ways more than the works that black artists do today.
Why?
Because today black artists are very much concerned with their heritage in the sense of subject matter and content, which very often is a local subject reflecting upon the black community. and this does not have widespread appeal to white audience. So those black artists who, for the most part, have been very successful outside of, let's say, Jacob Lawrence, Charles White, who incidentally was a Los Angeles artist, and let's say Romare Bearden, for the most part, have been artists who have permitted their work to become part and parcel of the mainstream tradition.
Mm-hmm. Basically, are they artists who also struggle with definitions for themselves and their work?
Yes, the black artists of today, those who are concerned with heritage and images reflecting their African ancestry, they seek to find a definition which is acceptable in the black community. And as I said, very often this isn't the appeal of the majority culture. So their art is not always patronized by museums, isn't always written about by curators and critics, and is left pretty much to be discussed and dispersed amongst people in the black community.
Mm-hmm. So the emergence of the black middle class has had some impact then
It has.
on influencing that.
Yes, it has, and it is interesting, whereas the black middle class has been very much mainstream in its taste, it is more and more beginning to say, I want to see something special about black artists, because the parents want to have role models for their children, and they want to be able to point out specifically a subject which does have some black relevance to a child and say, well, this was done by such and such an artist, I knew him, or what have you. So there's more of that now than there was, say, 35 or 40 years ago. On the other hand, 35 or 40 years ago, this was the birth of black interest and commitment to subject matter which reflected black images, and that came by way of the Negro Renaissance. When it was localized in New York, it was referred to as the Harlem Renaissance, and much of that is reflected in this particular exhibition, Hidden Heritage, at the California Afro-American Museum.
How generally do people respond, especially young people, to what's contained in the exhibition?
You have interest on several levels. The young people look at it, if they are into black history, they look at it with great excitement and amazement, especially the early works in which there are no black subjects. And they are the first to ask the questions, why don't we see black subjects here? Then you have another level of coming from an audience which students might say, why is there so much emphasis on black subjects? Because many of our kids have grown up not knowing the struggles, the toils of these artists to become a part of the mainstream of American culture, or for the society in general, for black society in general, to become part and parcel of the culture without all of the signs identifying blackness and so forth. So they're not always familiar with the struggles, with what has happened prior to the Civil Rights Movement. So when youngsters ask these questions, they're very naive very often because they aren't aware of history. When older people ask the questions, they're very often asking them based on their own experiences. Why wasn't there more black identification, for example, going on at a particular period?
Mm-hmm. Now, if the dollar basically dictated what the black artist was producing early on, and the emergence of the black class and middle class, their tastes and expectations dictated somewhere here in the middle, what in the future do you believe will dictate what will influence and be responsible for what ultimately black artists are responding to?
Oh, that's a big order. But I do believe that there will never be the so-called melting pot attitude of the meshing in American culture, which will eradicate the need for ethnic identification and ethnic heritage. Because I think this is one of our strengths. We all want to be equal, yes, but we don't want the notion that when one sees a black subject, it will be amazement and astonishment. So I think you will always have black artists, even with the economic outpouring and buying, and we do see blacks buying more art than before. I think you will always have the need within the community for black subjects, for people to show their heritage, their history. And this has been proven by way of the various ethnic communities from Europe. The form of dress that they keep, the foods that they keep within the community, and so forth. And I think we'll have the same thing when it comes to the visual arts amongst blacks.
Mm-hmm. Do black artists have a problem with being considered rather when they are primarily producing work that make cultural or ethnic and even social statements?
Yes, they still have a problem with what might be referred to as mainstream institutions. Mainstream institutions like the major museums do not buy many of those works. They may buy one here and there. And the attitude is generally, well, we have one work by such and such a person. But that, of course, does not represent the widespread numbers that we see throughout the country where blacks are producing in large numbers. And it does not always represent the subject matter that blacks are into. There is a cross-section of subject matters and ideas that blacks express in their art. And this exhibition is a good example of that. It shows what is there in the sense of the minds of the artist over a period of some 150 years. So, yes, there are problems. I don't think we'll ever overcome them in the sense of completely eradicating them because of the politics of society, because of the cultural definitions within our society, and because there are many people who feel that it's just not necessary for us all to blend in and have one kind of image making.
Well, the one important point there, not that they all aren't important, but one of the ones I was thinking about was the ability to make a living is seriously hindered when that kind of attitude prevails.
Exactly.
Does it discourage a lot of black artists from maybe doing more work?
It does discourage some from doing the kinds of things that they would like to be doing or redefining or defining themselves because there isn't always a market for that kind of imagery. As I said a little earlier, there is a developing market, but it still isn't as widespread. It isn't as well known, as well advertised. And so one tends to do what is, for the most part, not all artists, but I would say many artists tend to do what is safe and saleable. They tend to take jobs that they know they will make a living at. And, of course, they can't be faulted for that because we all have to survive. But I think that our images are nothing like as bold, as critical. They don't always show commentary, which, incidentally, the white community basically assumes that our images will be. When you ask a person of majority culture to define what a black artist does or is like, the assumption is that you're going to come up with an image which deals with protest, with a commentary statement, etc.
Some poverty statement.
Poverty, oppression, injustice, what have you. And that's what was called black art in the 60s. It almost had to make a social statement. But many artists feel that they can rise above that, and I think it's important for us to show the wideness of that. You know, it's not just one statement. At least that's what I try and do when I speak and lecture and what have you.
And overall, is that one of the major accomplishments of Hidden Heritage Afro-American Art, 1800 to 1950?
It is. It is one of the accomplishments. It shows that blacks have been abstractionists, they have been realists, they have been social realists. They have made all of these statements. And incidentally, This is one of the things that I try and concentrate on when I come as a curator to a community to talk about something of this nature.
Great. Dr. Driskell, I'd like to thank you very much for coming by and sharing this insight into Black American art and the Black American artist.
Quite welcome.
Our guest has been Dr. David Driskell, a curator and the professor of art at the University of Maryland. I'm Vivian Porter, and I hope you'll all join me again next week.
Heritage, an opportunity to learn more about the men and women shaping the history of America's minorities. Heritage is an RKO Radio Public Affairs program produced by Vivian Porter in the studios of KRTH Los Angeles.